Hi, we're here with Emmanuel Madan, composer, sound artist. He's been one half of the user for, I think, since 1998, if I remember correctly. Has been working on solo projects all this time as well, a curator, but also wears a whole bunch of different hats as well. He's the national director of the Independent Media Arts Alliance. Has even worked as a program officer at the Canada Council, so a real wide variety of experience. And we're here to talk a little bit about his work in the Digital Economies Lab and some subjects that interact with these ideas and the work there. How are you doing today?
Really well.
Good, good. I guess we'll just start off with some a simple question of, like, given all of those different hats and those different roles that you played, what is it that kind of drew you to working in the Digital Economies Lab in a project like this?
So I think the initial questions of the lab around artist prosperity are ones that I've grappled with in a number of from a number of angles. As you mentioned, I've held a variety of different roles in the arts environment, and sustainability, economic sustainability for artists, especially artists starting out today, is a huge concern for me. I really like to think about long-term viability. I like to think about how the arts ecosystem is a system, is something that potentially works together in self-sustaining, self-supporting ways. And I was just really curious to take part in what I think is too rare of a conversation. These are questions that we should be thinking about all the time, that more of us should be thinking about. So I really welcomed the chance to contribute to such a dialogue.
So I think you jumped around to different projects here and there. Do you want to give a quick overview of some of the projects that you worked on? And then I think also talking a bit about ideas that emerge both in the conversation around those projects, but that didn't necessarily make it into the projects, that maybe are extending beyond the lab itself.
Right. Well, I think the first thing that I got involved with was in partnership with Swintac, and it was a thing called Crate Swap, in which we were kind of thinking about reuse and recycling and repurposing of a very basic piece of hardware, of material for touring artists. This idea that there's this crazy economy of shipping crates that circulates all the time all over the world, and there's always, at any given moment, an artist needs a crate that they don't have, and that probably at a similar moment there are artists that have more crates than they need, and we sort of tried to tease out some opportunities there, with a longer term goal, I think, of thinking about sharing and swapping economies more generally. So if we could make it work for a relatively generic piece of equipment like a shipping crate, then perhaps we could also make it work for excess materials or various pieces of equipment that only come into play every once in a while. Or so we had, we sort of developed a basic framework for that, and afterwards, I found myself in conversation with 3 other Dell members in what eventually became known as Artwork Local 404, which is a proposal for a cultural workers and artists union, sort of a speculative union, basically. that served as a discussion forum for um, organizing generally. Like how do artists, self-employed artists, come together in the sorts of formations that we historically would definitely have called unions, but those opportunities with sort of a more kind of freelance model are not as simple, perhaps as they once were. Perhaps not as they're probably just as simple actually, but they're not as ready to hand. So we spent a bunch of time fleshing out a proposal for what a union could look like and how we might constitute something that actually corresponded to the needs of these workers.
So in some of those projects, certainly one was about resource sharing and another about organizing the labor, creating a sort of organized structure, or imagining what that would be. Are there ideas that did kind of emerge through those discussions that didn't come into a project, or that wouldn't fit in the scope of what the Digital Economies Lab was doing?
Oh, one of the things that perhaps is less evident in the output from Art Local 404 is it ended up being an artistic endeavor in a certain sense, more than an economic proposal. Basically, when we got to the point where we were creating a phone-based interactive interface for people, for callers to navigate, that was when I really felt like my usual predilections as an artist, that is to sort of engage with software and really get into the guts of like how systems are designed at the software level, like that became like a really exciting thing for me to work on, and it was Izzy and myself primarily. Like Izzy sort of set up this development environment for a phone-based interface, and it sparked a lot of, I think, really interesting ideas that I look forward to carrying on, in the future, and sort of like there's a kinship with some of the projects that I've done as part of User, where you sort of inhabit these like extremely technical and often quite sterile or even hostile environments, like a phone interface, push one, push two, push three, like the like one of the most hated technological inventions of this age. That's really interesting for me to sort of get into the guts of and play around with, and sort of think about those constraints and that like extremely limiting logic, and how you can nevertheless like arrive at something that's imaginative.
And yet, there's a kind of nostalgia for a phone interface all of a sudden, as much of that has gone away, and then you also see the sort of meteoric rise of something like Clubhouse, which suddenly became, a kind of like fad of interest in audio, like in this speaking. So I wonder if was there in those discussions, was there something particular about, because some of it was about leaving a voice message, a kind of like, what was it about the phone that and the voice as a part of an organizing principle, or a kind of connectivity, in terms of thinking not just artistically but organizationally?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there's an immediacy about phone-based interfaces, and it worked well, I think, with the fictional proposal that we were making, that like we were sort of representing a community of artists who would have disappeared from online platforms, and so we were kind of reverting to these earlier, more dated technologies and like kind of reanimating these spaces that had been abandoned with the arrival of digital platforms.
So,
Not that phone interfaces are ultimately a digital platform also, but
right.
there's something about the interface that feels quite different. And as to the voice element, I mean, I'm someone who comes from a background of transmission-based practices. I spent a number of years working in radio as a broadcaster, and you know, a lot of kind of experimental uses of transmission technology. And so working with the telephone as a transmission technology was an interesting exploration for us, I think.
Yeah, and as a transmission, because it was it was to receive a message, but also was it an exchange? Was it also to send a message? Was it a send and receive system, or it was?
It was an interactive system. The main thing that we developed as part of this project was there are a number of pre-recorded messages, and the user navigates through these messages by means of a touchtone interface. So the system is collecting responses from callers. But they're digital responses. They're like numerical responses that can then be analyzed as sort of as data, basically. So the thrust of the questions was what kinds of challenges and problems and frustrations do you face as someone who's trying to make a living as a creative person? And we proposed, possible challenges that people might be facing that are based on our own lived experience as artists. So, and we were, we were using these as prompts to get people to think about the situation that they find themselves in. And some of that is economic. Some of it, has your work been stolen? Or have you been underpaid for the work that you've produced? Have you lost control over your intellectual property? But there were also other considerations, other forms of exploitation other than economic. So, are you in an exploitative or abusive relationship with your employer or the client that has contracted you? And what are the intersections of that with other forms of exploitation around, say, gender or age or racialization or economic class?
We've had discussions over the course of the Digital Economies Lab about thinking the reinvention of infrastructure for different generation, for different communities. Like how do you think, with all of these different experiences you've had at different scales of artistic production, from policy down to working in the workshop like the one behind you, how do you think about this process of reinventing organizational models or institutions? Do they need to die and be reborn? Can they be transformed? How do we think about that process?
Right. I mean, I think that there's probably a difference between models and instantiations of those models. So, the model of the collective, for example, is something that's extremely versatile and super resilient, and I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. How a collective, an artist collective, is actually implemented, how it's actually put into place by the individuals that animate that model is always going to be different. But I think that the key is being able to recognize what parts of a model are interesting and applicable and should be communicated, across communities or down generations. Because I think that a lot of that knowledge of like that kind of organizing practice does not make it down the generations or across to new groups, and as a result, there's a lot of perhaps unnecessary reinvention that has to keep happening because people don't recognize what could be useful to them as they form their own thing and as they sort of embark on their particular grouping or project or ultimately even institution. So I think that there's a kind of a heritage, and the artist run center that came to prominence, a good 40 or more years ago, like has a lot of benefit to it. There's a lot of accumulated knowledge there, which I think is really worth valuing and transferring into the sorts of structures that are being formed today.
Yeah, I wonder, one of the great challenges, and that we've seen appear as a theme in the DEL, this idea of transmission of knowledge and sharing knowledge, and even, what we're grappling with as we reach, the end of a certain phase of this kind of research that we're doing. How do we share the ideas that have been developed? But then I think you're drawing out a much a longer arc of this issue of how to share and adapt knowledge over generations, not necessarily just age generations, but different cycles of people who come into organizations. When you think of a lot of certain kinds of instability that might happen in an organization with people leaving all the time and having to relearn, especially at small organizations. So how, is there ways that we can think of, or have you sort of thought about different ways that we can approach this? Because I think in this lab we initially put a proposal together that certainly centered or thought a lot of technology as like something that you could use, you could automate something, you could do something. And what the response from the participants has been thinking around technology and how to not resist it, but think of other issues to be grappled with, and then approach technology from this sort of second phase and trying to incorporate it. So as you have identified these things, like in your case, there's the idea of labor organization, but this other one of transmission of knowledge, of sharing of know-how, sharing of skills, sharing of how to put these models into the practice at the ground level. How do we think of different ways to do that? That's a big question.
And I think, there's so much of the importance is how the work gets done and who's doing the work. I was thinking a little bit about Kite's Almanac, which is another of the projects that's emerged out of the DEL, and I think it's really, really interesting the way that she's going about putting this together. Initially, when I sort of saw the early stages of the proposal, I was like, oh, well, actually, the organization where I work already has one of these. We have a thing called Imosource, which is really intended to fit exactly this purpose. But the fact of the matter is that, no, it's not. Who is behind an initiative has everything to do with what elements they're gonna find to place into this compendium, this encyclopedia of knowledge, of experience. And so I think that it's really important that these initiatives proliferate and that they're done in close relation to the communities of practice that they're intended to address. But then what's equally important is that we have meaningful mechanisms for transference between these perhaps somewhat parallel projects, that there is an interoperability between what everybody's doing, so that if a particular instantiation of a model doesn't quite work, you could easily be directed to something similar, but not identical, but that might be more suitable for your case. And I think I was just listening to the interview that you did with Tim, and at one point he talks about a mesh network. I think this is like a really interesting model for decentralized yet coordinated organizing.
I think that also came up actually in the discussion with Suzanne about where the almanac has arrived, or it is in this current state, and this idea of a kind of modularity that stretches or nodes on a network that can be adapted to a community context. I think that's a really it's a really interesting part of the whole research project, really, is to see how important sort of metaphors and ways of speaking are really important to the productive aspects of what will come next. How important for you is it to find the right terms to discuss it? I think even, going back to that earlier point that I remember having in the first weekend of workshops, saying it was one of the projects that I don't think it turned into the 404, was, doesn't this feel like you're sort of reinventing an organization that you work for? But it was reinventing it under different terms. And so I guess I'm asking, for you, do you see that importance? Do you think it's important to find the right terms that will actually redirect projects in new ways?
There's no doubt. I mean, terms are vitally important. Choice of terms is not trivial, and I think that it has a huge impact on how things are perceived. One of the things about artwork Local 404 is it participates in the language of union, but I think it's really trying to get at the fundamentals of the idea of union, which have over time, I think, largely been forgotten. I think sort of current understandings of organized labor are very institutionalized. There's a connotation of heavy bureaucracy, top heaviness, all that stuff, right? This is partly why unions have such a bad rap in contemporary society. Is there's all of this structure, right? But I think the understanding that the four of us had in proposing the union was, we're, I think, inspired by non-institutionalized ideas about basic union and solidarity, right? So I think probably the closest antecedent would be the IWW, the one big union, which really tries to keep away from what ended up happening in the union movement, which was a heavy bureaucratization and ultimately division, right? Like the fact that like you're in these very small negotiating units is really very much counter to the fundamental idea of like we stand together, the working class and the ruling class have nothing in like those sorts of very basic, idealistic, sure, perhaps even a little simplistic, but like those are the stark like founding realities of the union movement, and I think it was important to sort of recenter those understandings.
Well, and it's going back to the criticism that is often launched against the union, that bureaucratic of that slowing things down is a bad thing, right? That we have characterized that slowness as a problem, where that it's one of the, I think, most challenging parts of contemporary society is to figure out where we need to go slower and where we do need to go faster. Like we're extremely slow in figuring out how we can care for a wider range of people, how to deal with issues of, well, for instance, access to water, extremely slow. And yet there's other places where we need, whether it's a bureaucracy or to move slowly, to actually resist that the speed in order to have different kinds of considerations. So trying to figure out too a way where actually slowness could is a value that we need more of. We need to slow certain things down.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point, and deliberation basically is what needs to take sufficient time, and democracy is a slow process and must be so in order to be meaningful. And so this is, I think, part and parcel of that.
Yeah, it's bringing it back to the project and actually the idea of listening. I don't know. I have this idea in my mind that the project at some point touched on people leaving messages. That there was like an element of like just listening to what people needed, like just listening to the stories or whatever. Is that a fantasy?
That was part of the plan, but we didn't actually make it that far.
It's in the next phase. It's in the next phase. Yeah. To sort of shift over to the question of how we share ideas and things that happen and in the program like this, and we've taken on these conversations because we think it's a more sort of nuanced approach to trying to talk about and share the ideas in the program. I wonder if that's how you've thought about these ideas of sharing knowledge and what different ways that we can approach sharing outputs, sharing projects, and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, what should I say about this? I think it's a real challenge. I think that like the milieu that I work in at the moment research is a huge part of the activity, and I think that there's a lot of work that needs to happen after the research is complete. How do you translate that knowledge and convey it in ways that are actually useful to people who would benefit from finding out about this stuff, and I think there's a huge level of skill there that needs to be developed further, where you're able to offer insights from all of this work, like as we were just saying, this is slow work, it's deliberative work, it's work that takes, in order to be useful, it must take time. So that means it's probably also fairly voluminous as a body of of output. So how do you get from there, from like all of the complexity and nuance of like a long sustained learning period to being able to interest someone who's new to the knowledge in certain ways that will get them interested in finding out more. And so there's a lot to do there. Like I think there's everything from packaging pieces of information in ways that are engaging to folks that just stumble across this in whatsoever a way, like whether it's a tweet or whatever it may be, but things that are also not like reductive, that point to further knowledge as opposed to trying to glibly summarize something that is maybe not so summarizing.
Well, that idea of sort of layering, like giving people ways to dig deeper into things rather than simply fragmentation, like rather than simply cutting it up and dispersing it, how do we make these different avenues to arrive at, and give people access to the tools? I mean, it seems like an increasingly complicated question, although it also seems like there's a new, not just even before the pandemic, there was a significant shift in the way people were thinking about arts organizations, or maybe we're just getting old and we're the organizations we've been involved in are dying off and new things are growing anyways. But it did feel like there's new ways of organizing that were emerging even before the pandemic, and that this has accelerated. Obviously, there's a kind of a crisis at the heart of it for the world, and then for us within the cultural world. It's been this dramatic event. But I wonder if you've seen other models through the work that you're doing that are really inspiring around different ways of organizing and sort of responding to a new generation of creators.
I think there's a lot to be said for one-on-one conversation. Like basically the idea of the brain date. The organization that I run is just embarking on like a project of sort of digital capacity building, and I think one of the primary techniques that we plan to use is really just like matching up this person with this other person, and trying to figure out like intelligent ways to provoke conversations between people who are meeting for the first time or have met but only in passing, but somehow like determining that like these two folks have got something to say to each other, that there's a kind of learning that happens in this kind of a one-on-one conversation that is difficult to reproduce in larger structures. So I really think that there's that's a big piece of it's an important part of this moment, especially in this sort of screen-dominated world that we find ourselves in, where larger groupings become logistically, more complex the more people you add in, and like coordinating people's schedules and stuff like that is always difficult. But there's like that basic like human form of conversation is something that's like, I think, really, really valuable and really worth like putting a lot of energy into.
It's totally, I find it really fascinating because that's, really like the idea that I was talking about, what happened in the project of many people kind of zigging to the zag of us sort of proposing certain types of technology. That's like the in some ways this antithetical component of like, what is the most important element we need is this individual conversations. We need individual interaction in order to build the kind of organizational knowledge sharing. Do you think that is, do you think part of that comes from a long history of working with technology in the creative milieu? Like I know, with here at Artengine, as we saw, the pandemic take effect, we felt like we saw a history of media art happen to the rest of the arts world in like the space of 6 months. They went through all of these different like cycles that we've seen over the course of our time working with technology. Do you think that there's a sense of, or is it something else, I guess? Do you think it's coming from the work that we've already done with technology in the organizations, in our personal practices, or is there something else that's happening there?
Well, I think there's, definitely in the fields in which we work, like technology is a given, and we're like, it's really like infused all of our conceptualization of the world around us. Like all of our metaphors are heavily informed by digital tools and practices. So I think we have a special kind of comfort with these ways of doing things. It also means that we're maybe less patient, when things are poorly designed, or we're not willing to accept things as they are presented to the average technological consumer. And I think that's a great thing because it empowers us to sort of modify or tweak the tool so that it does suit our needs, and to think like to not accept technology as it's delivered, as it's marketed, as the only possible way that things can work.
Well, I think that we've gone over quite a few interesting things in our time together. Maybe we'll close up our conversation here and say aloha. Thanks
Very
for
nice
joining
chatting
me
with
here.
you, Ryan. And thanks so much for pulling this whole adventure together. It's been really, really interesting and stimulating. And as we've just said, I hope that the results are something that will be useful for other people that are just finding out about it now.
Well, thanks for your chat today and your contributions overall. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks. Take care, Ryan.